Ransom rode home 2 years after Cottonwood country buried him for dead, expecting to find nothing left of his wife's grave but weeds, and what stopped him cold at his own gate would undo everything he thought he knew about debts and kindness. He had prepared himself in 26 months of dying by inches, on a mountain nobody bothered to name, for a house gone dark, and a roof caved in, and a bank notice nailed crooked to his own front door. He had not prepared himself for smoke. It curled up thin and steady from his own chimney, a quarter-mile off, on a morning so still he could smell the wood smoke before he could trust his eyes. His fences stood mended and straight along the road. His fields ran green with a crop somebody had planted and somebody had watered and somebody, God help him, had loved. And in the corral, where his herd should have been 2 winters dead on a mountainside, fat cattle grazed, glossy-coated, tended, alive. Ransom sat his worn-out horse in the middle of the road and simply stared, because a dead man does not come home to a living farm, and yet there it stood, in front of him breathing. Then the door of his own house opened, and a woman he had never once laid eyes on stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on her apron, and went white as bone at the sight of him. Stay with this one to the end, because before this story is finished, a debt Ransom Cade forgot inside a month will come back 7 years later to save the very life he had given up on. And if you have ever done a kindness and never learned what it did for the stranger who received it, this is Cottonwood country in the 1880s, cattle country, hard country, the kind of country that swallowed men whole and rarely gave them back. What played out on that porch that morning is still passed valley to valley to this day. But to understand why a woman he had never met stood in his yard tending his cattle and mending his fences, and, though he did not yet know it, laying fresh flowers on his dead wife's grave every season for 2 years running, back past the killing winter on the mountain, back past the drive that broke him, back to the beginning, when Ransom Cade had a wife named Eloan, and a debt he could not pay, and no earthly idea that 7 years earlier he had already bought his own salvation and forgotten he had ever done it. Eloan Cade died in the last week of a bitter February, of a fever that came on fast and would not break, and Ransom buried her himself on the rise behind the house because he could not stand the thought of strangers' hands lowering her down. They had built the place together out of nothing, 4 years of clearing brush and hauling stone and putting up a house board by board with their own 4 hands, the kind of home that gets built slow because it is meant to hold a whole life inside it. Eloan had wanted children in that house, and a porch swing and an apple orchard on the south slope that would take 10 years to bear proper fruit, a wait she claimed never to mind, since she planned on being there the whole 10 years and plenty after. She got none of it. She got a fever in February, and a hole in the frozen ground that took Ransom and 2 neighbors most of a day to dig, and after that, a wooden marker with her name burned into it, and a widower who stopped sleeping in the house's one good bed because he could not do it without reaching for a woman who was not there. Grief alone might have been survivable, in time, the way most griefs are survived, badly, slowly, one gray morning after another. What made it unsurvivable was the note. Ransom and Eloan had gone to the Sable Rock Bank 3 years earlier, to borrow against the place back when the future still looked wide open, back when a man could reasonably plan on paying a debt down over the span of a marriage, instead of alone and grieving with a bad season on his hands. $300 and interest that did not care one particle whether a man's wife was living or dead. Ransom had made the payments while Elowen lived, the two of them scraping and saving and promising each other it would be worth it. He tried to keep making them after he sold what stock he could spare. He hired himself out for day wages on other men's spreads until his own fields went half untended. He watched the note come due each season like a tide he could not turn back. And by the fall, after Elowen's death, he understood, in the plain arithmetic way, a man understands a thing he cannot argue with, that he was going to lose the land they had built together. And that losing it would mean losing the very last thing of hers he still had left in the world. So when word came through Cottonwood that a big outfit up north was hiring drovers for a drive clear through the territory and over the divide to the railhead at Larkin's Crossing, 2,200 head, hard country, worse weather, wages that paid double on account of half the men who signed on for a drive like that did not finish it. Ransom Cade put his name to the roster without asking a single question past the pay. One season's wages, he reasoned, would clear the note whole and leave something over besides. Gone 4 months, 5 at the outside, if the weather turned mean early, that was the whole of his arithmetic. At the Sable Rock counter, he promised the balance in full by first snow. Old Purdy, the clerk, a thin, careful man who had known Ransom and Elowen both since before their wedding, only nodded slow, the nod of a man who had no wish to be the one standing on a porch reading out a foreclosure notice to a widower. Ransom rode north the next morning without looking back at the house. He looked once at the rise where Elowen lay, and then he pointed his horse at the trail and did not turn his head again, because he understood that if he let himself grieve one more minute standing in that yard, the drive went wrong, the way only the high country in a bad year can make a thing go wrong. They pushed the herd hard through good weather for the first 6 weeks, made better time than anyone expected, and then the mountains took them by the throat. The worst winter in 20 years of range memory came down out of the north 2 weeks early, and did not let up, burying the high pastures under drifts that stood taller than a mounted man. Ransom fought for 3 straight days to save what stock he could, half blind in a whiteout that turned noon into midnight, and on the 3rd day, his horse went down on a shelf of buried ice and rolled, and Ransom came up out of the snow with his leg broken clean through in 2 places and no way on God's earth to walk it off. The outfit's foreman got him down off the mountain on a horse-drawn sled to a snowed-in settlement called Widow's Bend, where a half-trained doctor set the bone by lamplight and gave it to him plain, lucky to keep the leg at all and no walking anywhere before spring, if then. He lay in a stranger's back room through the worst of that winter, listening to the wind take the roof apart nail by nail, unable to send word south that he was even alive because Widow's Bend sat snowed off from the rest of the territory for the better part of 4 months, cut off by drifts and washed-out passes the way a man is cut off from his own life. By the time the passes opened and Ransom could sit a horse again, hobbling on a leg that had healed crooked and would ache every wet morning for the rest of his days, he had lost an entire season's wages along with most of the herd, and no way of proving to anyone that he had not simply died on that mountain along with 200 head of cattle and 6 other men who never came down at all. He started south anyway, slow, in a body that fought him every mile, and a second winter caught him on the road before he had gotten a third of the way home and held him fast in a line shack for sharing a fire and a pot of beans with a quiet trail hand named Reyes, who never once asked why the stranger talked in his sleep about a wife named Elowen and a debt he could not pay. By the time Ransom Cade finally came riding down the Cottonwood Road, 26 months had passed since the morning he rode away from Alowan's grave, and every soul in that country who had known him had long since given him up for dead. Nobody in Sable Rock had heard a word out of him in over a year. The story going around, by the time it had passed through enough mouths, had settled into plain fact. Ransom Cade died in the killing winter, same as half his outfit, and the bank was fixing to take his land the moment the paperwork cleared, there being no kin left to claim it. Ransom rode home already, having made his peace with all of it. He had 2 years alone on a mountain, and 2 more limping south to sit with the knowledge that he was almost certainly walking back into a foreclosed lot and a caved roof, and somewhere around the second winter he would stand once more on the ground he had built with Alowan, say the goodbye he had never gotten to say properly, and then go wherever a ruined man goes when there is nothing left holding him to any one place. He had no hope left in him at all going into that last quarter mile, which was precisely why the smoke stopped him so completely. He sat his horse in the road a long moment before he could make himself move again, and even after he nudged the animal forward, he did it slow, disbelieving the way a man approaches something he half expects to prove itself a trick of the light. It was not a trick. The closer he came, the more solid it all got, the fences mended tight and true, not a rail sagging anywhere along the whole run of them. The fields, standing thick with hay, cut clean and stacked proper against the coming winter. The barn roof patched fresh, the timber, lighter than the weathered gray around it, done recently by hands that knew their business. The yard swept bare of the leaves and drift that should have piled up 2 autumns deep around an abandoned place. And the cattle, not his old herd, lost whole on the mountain, but a new one, good stock, fat and glossy and calm in a corral built sound enough to hold them through any weather Cottonwood cared to send. The whole place, which by every right ought to have stood a ruin or gone over entirely to some stranger's claim, stood alive instead and cared for, and somehow more whole than the day he had ridden away from it grieving. As though the 2 years he had spent dying in the mountains, somebody down here had spent loving his land back to life, patient hour by patient hour, with no earthly reason to do it that he could think of. And then the door opened. She came out drying her hands on her apron the way a woman does when she has heard hoofbeats and stepped out to see whose they were, and she stopped dead 3 steps onto the porch boards at the sight of the gaunt stranger sitting, a worn-down horse, in her yard. Neither one of them moved for a long moment. She was somewhere near 40, Ransom judged plain in the honest way of a woman who has spent her life working rather than being looked at, with a strong, steady face and dark hair pulled back simple, and a body shaped by real labor, broad through the shoulders from swinging an axe, sun-browned at the throat, her sleeves rolled to the elbow over forearms that had clearly done a man's share of fence work. There was a quiet handsomeness in her that had nothing to do with being young, the kind that comes from a face that has been tested and has not once flinched, and Ransom found himself staring at her the way a person stares at something that cannot possibly be standing in front of them and yet plainly is. "This is the Cade place." His voice came out rusty from disuse, rougher than he meant it. "My place. I'm Ransom Cade." He watched every drop of color go out of her face. "Or I was before. What are you doing on my land?" Her hand found the porch rail as though her legs had gone out from under her, and her voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "Ransom Cade." The name sounded like something she had not let herself speak out loud in a long while. "They told us you died on the drive. In the killing winter, The whole valley. Everybody said Ransom Cade's dead on the mountain. God rest him." Her hand rose to her mouth. "You're alive." "Alive," he allowed, baffled clean through by the depth of feeling written plain on a stranger's face. "Barely, and 2 years late for it. But I don't know you, ma'am. I have never once set eyes on you. How is it you know my name? How is it my place stands whole, when by every right the bank should have had it the day my last payment failed to come in?" He swung down off the horse, stiff and slow, favoring the leg that had never healed straight, and stood in his own dooryard on legs that did not entirely trust the ground. "Who are you?" Her eyes had gone bright with tears, though her voice held steady enough. "My name is Cordelia Marsh. Though it's been other names before this one, you don't know me, Mr. Bite." "Cade, but I have carried your name in my prayers for 7 years, and you saved my whole life once, and rode on before I could so much as learn your face to thank you for it." A long breath, shaking. "And when word came that you'd died, and that the place you loved was about to be taken from you, same as everything was once nearly taken from me, I came here to pay you back the only way I had left to give." Ransom stared at her across his own dooryard. "I never saved anybody's life. I would remember a thing like that." "You would not." Cordelia's smile was small and sad and seemed to cost her something to hold. "Kata. It was nothing to you. It was everything to me. Become a channel member for stories exactly like this one. The join button sits right beside the channel name, and it helps keep them coming." She told it slow, standing there on the porch of a house that was not yet clear whether it belonged to her or him. And Ransom listened the way a man listens when the ground keeps shifting under his boots. 7 years before that morning, Cordelia had been a young widow on a hardscrabble spread 2 days east along the Yellow Fork. Her first husband, Eli, 3 months dead of a fever that had swept through that country the same bad winter it took half the livestock with it. He had left her nothing but a small debt against the place, no more than $60. And $60 was a sum a young widow with no family and no stock and no crop in the ground had absolutely no way on earth to raise before the bank's deadline. The Yellow Fork Bank had set to take the farm and turn her out into the snow with whatever she could carry on her back, and Cordelia had understood, in the plain way a person understands the worst thing that has ever happened to them, that she was about to lose the only roof she had and be put out to freeze or starve, whichever came first. She had been sitting on the porch of that doomed little house one gray afternoon, past crying, simply waiting for the end of it, the way a person waits out a storm they cannot outrun, when a stranger rode through on his way somewhere else entirely. He had stopped in the little town nearby to water his horse and buy salt, and heard the way a man hears things in a small place, about the widow 2 miles out fixing to lose her home over a debt that to a man with means was hardly worth mentioning. That stranger young, then, Cordelia guessed, though carrying already the kind of gravity a man gets from having buried somebody he loved, rode to the bank himself and paid the whole of her debt out of his own pocket, every dollar of it. When the banker asked whose name to credit the payment to, the stranger gave only his first name, and a single line besides, that somebody had once done a kindness for him when he was down on his own luck, and he was simply passing the debt along the way it was meant to travel, and she owed him nothing but to do the same for some other stranger. When she was able, then he rode away before she ever came down off that porch to so much as look him full in the face. I never even saw you clear. Her voice caught on it. I only learned your name after, from the banker, Ransom Cade, out of Cottonwood Country, a rancher, married, come through on his way home from the railhead. I carried that name 7 years, Mr. Cade, like another woman might carry a psalm. You gave me my whole life back and asked for not one thing in return, and I never once got the chance to thank you for it, and it sat on me heavy as a debt every single day since. Because a kindness that size does not simply go away because the man who did it forgot he'd ever done it. Ransom stood in his own yard and could not find one word to answer her with. Then, last year, she went on, word came through the Yellow Fork country that Ransom Cade of Cottonwood had died on a cattle drive in the killing winter, and that the Sable Rock Bank was fixing to seize his land for an unpaid note with no kin left to claim it. By then, my own farm had been gone a long while, sold off after my second husband Tobias passed of consumption 3 winters back, and I had been drifting since, taking in wash and hiring out where a widow woman could find honest work. I heard the man who had saved my whole life was dead, and his home about to be lost right along with him, and I thought, here is the one thing left that I can do. Here is how I pay back a man who will never even know I did it, now that he's gone. Where he'll never hear the thanks, I'll save his land the way he once saved mine. She had not decided it easy, she admitted, and told him something of the deciding. 3 days sitting alone with the news before she trusted herself to act on it, turning the notion over and over, the way a person turns over a thing that sounds like foolishness spoken out loud and yet will not let them alone. She had no kin to ask, no husband left to weigh in either for or against it. Nothing behind her at all, but a strong back, and a debt she had carried 7 years, and never once found a way to repay. She told herself, sitting on the step of the rooming house where she took in wash, that a woman with nothing left to lose has one advantage over every soul who has something. She is free to do the foolish, decent thing. So she sold the little she owned that would fetch a price, packed the rest into a single trunk, and set out for Cottonwood country with barely enough silver in her pocket to last the journey, let alone build a claim on a stranger's ranch. She had come to Cottonwood with almost nothing, the last few dollars she had saved a strong back, and nowhere else in the world she particularly needed to be. Straight to the Sable Rock Bank she went and asked old Purdy, the clerk, to let her take up the note in Ransom Cade's name, a strange widow with no legal claim to the property, offering what little she had against the debt of a man everyone believed dead, promising to work the land itself to pay down the rest over time. Purdy, who would rather have had a slow trickle of real payments on a hard-to-sell, out-of-the-way spread than the trouble of foreclosing and reselling it to nobody in particular. Let her, on the condition she keep the payments regular. Cordelia Marsh moved on to the Cade place entirely alone, in a country where she knew not one living soul, and worked it the way she had worked every hard piece of ground she had ever put her hands to, plowed the fields herself behind a borrowed team, bought a few head of stock with what savings she had left and built the herd up slow and careful, season after season kept the note paid down dollar by dollar, through 2 solid years of labor that would have broken plenty of men half again her size, holding a stranger's land alive and whole, purely to settle a debt of the heart he himself had long since forgotten he was ever owed. There'd been a bad stretch in the second winter, she admitted, when a run of dry weather thinned the herd, and a Cottonwood rancher named Osgood Vane rode out twice, offering to buy the place off her outright cheap, on the reasoning that a lone woman could not hope to hold it through another season. Cordelia had turned him away both times without so much as inviting him down off his horse, though the second offer had come at the exact moment her last dollar went into the note payment, and she had nothing left in the house but a sack of beans and a debt still owing. She had gone to bed hungry more nights that winter than she ever told a living soul, and had gotten up every one of those mornings anyway and gone back out to the fence line, because quitting had never once in her whole hard life struck her as an option worth considering. "I tended your wife's grave too," she said quietly, something in her voice going even softer. "I never knew her. But I knew it would matter to the man who once saved a stranger without asking her name, so I kept it clear of weeds and put fresh flowers up there every season it was possible to find them. I hope that was not a liberty I had no right to take." Ransom Cade, hollowed clean out by 2 years of grief and 2 more of ruin, put his face in his weathered hands right there in his own dooryard, and wept for Elowen, for the 26 lost months, and for the plain unbearable fact that while he had been dying by inches on a mountain that did not even know his name, a stranger he could not for the life of him remember had been down here the whole while loving his land and his dead wife's grave back to life, asking for nothing at all in return. "I came home to say goodbye to it." He managed the words at last when he could trust his voice. "I thought it was all gone, Elowen, the land, every last piece of it. I came back to stand here one more time and then go on wherever a ruined man goes, because I had nothing left in me to build with. And you," he shook his head, overwhelmed clear through, "you've been here the whole time, keeping it." Keeping her, he looked at the thriving place around him, and at the plain, strong, quietly lovely woman who had saved it, and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut since the day he buried Elowen. "There is no thanking a thing like this, Cordelia. There is no way I know of to thank it. You don't owe me thanks." Her shoulders straightened, the way a person braces to say a hard thing plain. "I owed you 7 years, and now it's paid, and the land is yours free and clear, waiting the way it always should have been." Something both proud and terribly sad moved through her voice. "I'll gather my few things tonight. It's your home, and you're alive, thank God for it, and there's no further call for me here. I only ever came to hold it for you. I'll be gone by morning, and you needn't trouble yourself over me. I'm well used to moving on." She turned to go inside and start packing, this woman who had spent 2 whole years of her one life saving a dead man's home, and who now meant to walk away from it the very hour he returned, without asking for one single thing for herself. "Wait." She stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, really looked at the plain work, strong, quietly beautiful woman standing on his porch, who had loved his land back to living health better than his own grief had let him love it these last years, who had repaid a forgotten kindness with 2 years of her own hard-won life, and now meant to vanish back down a lonely road without a word of want spoken for herself. Something moved in Ransom Cade's chest that had not moved since the week Elowen died. Not the old grief, but something standing entirely on the far side of it. Something that felt impossibly like the first warmth after a killing winter. "I can't work this place alone. That's the plain truth of it, and I might as well say it straight out. I'm half crippled from a bad leg the mountain left me with, and I've been gone 2 years, and you know this land now a sight better than I do myself. You've been the making of it while I was off dying somewhere. It would be a plain foolishness to send the one person alive who knows this place best off down the road." With nothing, he drew a breath. "Stay, help me work it." I'll pay you a fair wage, a partner's share, whatever's right by law and by decency, both. You saved this land. You've earned a place on it, if you want one." He swallowed hard. "Don't go, Cordelia, stay." Cordelia searched his face a long, careful moment, the way a person looks at an offer they are half afraid to trust. "You don't have to do that out of obligation. I told you plain. The debt's paid. You don't owe me a home for it. It isn't obligation. Or, it didn't start as anything but that, standing here 5 minutes ago. But you've kept my whole world alive for 2 years while I had nothing left to give it. And I rode in here today a dead man with nothing at all waiting for him, and the first living thing I've felt since I buried my wife is standing right here on my own porch telling me she's leaving." He shook his head slowly. "Stay, not because you owe me, and not because I owe you. Stay because I'm asking it plain, and because I think we've both been alone a good deal longer than either one of us ought to have been." She stayed. It began exactly as the partnership Ransom had offered. 2 people working the same beloved ground, careful with each other, respectful, each of them grateful, and each of them a little wary of leaning too hard on a kindness that might yet prove to be temporary. But a person cannot work a piece of land beside another soul. Season after season, sharing the plowing and the branding and the mending, sharing the weather, sharing the quiet suppers at the tired end of long days, without coming to know that person clear down to the bone. Ransom learned Cordelia's story in pieces, the way a man learns a person who does not talk easily about her own hard road. The 2 husbands buried, the 2 farms lost, the long, hard, drifting years of a widow with no people behind her and nowhere in particular she was expected. She did not complain, not once, not about the work nor the cold, nor the 2 years she had spent alone on a stranger's ranch with no company but the cattle, and a dead woman's grave she tended out of sheer stubborn decency. And Cordelia, in her turn, watched the hollowed-out grieving man she had found sitting a worn horse in her yard slowly begin to fill back up with life again, watched Ransom Cade come back to himself in careful stages, season by season, on the very land she had saved for him, until the grief-free Lowen settled at last into its proper gentled place. Leaving room, for the first time in years, for something new to grow. The work that first year was hard in the particular way that rebuilding is always hard. Slower and more grinding than either of them led on to the other. Ransom's leg would not let him sit a saddle more than half a day before it locked up on him something fierce, and he chafed at his own limits the way any man does who remembers what his body used to be able to do without asking. Cordelia never once let him see her treat him as less able for it. She simply worked alongside him, matched her pace to whatever his leg allowed that day, and found 100 quiet ways to shift the heavier labor onto her own shoulders without ever making it look like charity. She showed him, without a word of instruction, the small system she had built up over 2 years alone, which gate stuck in wet weather and needed lifting rather than pushed, which stretch of fence line the deer favored breaking through each fall, where the good grays held longest into a dry summer. Ransom, watching her move through what had once been his own land, with a fluency he himself had never quite managed even before the mountain broke him, understood slowly that she had not merely kept his ranch alive. She had, in 2 years of solitary, unthanked labor, made herself a rancher better than he had ever been, and he found he did not mind that one bit. He found, if he was honest with himself on the long, quiet evenings, that he rather loved watching her do it. Cordelia had a way, Ransom came to notice that first summer, of talking to the land itself as though it could hear her, murmuring low over a sick calf, telling a stubborn gate exactly what she thought of it, standing at the fence line some evenings with her hand flat against a post as if she were taking the pulse of the whole place. He asked her about it once, half teasing, and she had looked at him a long moment before answering plain that a body who spends 2 years alone with only cattle and fence rails, and a dead woman's grave for company, learns to talk to whatever will listen. Ransom did not tease her about it a second time. He found, instead, that he had started doing something close to the same thing himself, out at the far fence on his bad mornings, murmuring low to a stretch of land that had somehow managed to save itself through him. There was a morning in that first spring when a late blizzard rolled down off the high country, without warning, and caught them both out checking the fence line a mile from the house. And they spent 6 hard hours getting the herd down off the exposed rise, working side by side in a howling wind that made talk impossible, reading each other's intentions off nothing but a raised hand and a nod. When it was over and the herd stood safe and steaming in the barn's shelter, and the two of them stood soaked through and shaking with cold and exhaustion in the tack-room doorway, Cordelia laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, over the plain fact that between the two of them they had just done in 6 hours what it had taken her 2 full years alone to learn to do in half the time. Ransom laughed, too, for the first time in longer than he could rightly count, and something passed between them in that cold, wet doorway that neither one of them named yet, though both of them felt the shape of it plainly enough. The debt itself they cleared together that same first year, working the note down harder and faster with 2 sets of hands on it than Cordelia had ever managed alone. They drove a small herd of yearlings to the railhead that fall, and came back with enough in hand to pay the whole remaining balance at once, and rode into Sable Rock together on a cold, bright morning to do it. Old Purdy, who had watched Cordelia Marsh walk into his bank 2 years before as a stranger with nothing but a story and a handful of dollars, and who had quietly bet a fellow clerk she would not last 1 winter alone on that ranch, counted out the final payment with visible satisfaction, and stamped the ledger paid in full with more ceremony than the moment strictly required. "Never seen the like of it," he allowed, sliding the receipt across the counter. "A woman holding a dead man's land 2 whole years on the strength of an old kindness, and the dead man coming home to find it standing. Folks in this valley will be telling that one a long while yet." Cordelia colored at that and looked away uncomfortable, as she always was with being made the center of any story, and Ransom watched her discomfort with a fondness that surprised him with how deep it already ran. Not everyone in Cottonwood took as kindly to the arrangement as old Purdy did. There was talk in town, the way there is always talk in a small country where a widow and a widower live and work a shared piece of land under one roof, with no minister's blessing over any of it. Aldous Pruitt, who ran the mercantile and considered the moral condition of the whole valley her personal charge, made her opinion known to anyone who would stand still long enough to hear it. And more than once, Cordelia came back from a supply trip with her jaw set tight and her answers short, though she never once repeated to Ransom exactly what had been aimed at her face. It was Ransom running into Mrs. Messud. Pruitt himself outside the mercantile one cold Tuesday, who finally caught the substance of it plain, that a decent woman did not live unmarried under a man's roof, no matter what favor she had once done him, that Ransom Cade owed it to his late wife's memory to either marry the woman proper or send her on her way, and that the whole valley was watching to see which he would choose. Ransom rode home that day quieter than usual, turning the thing over. And it was not the gossip itself that troubled him. He had never in his life cared much what Mrs. Pruitt or anyone like her thought of his business. What troubled him was the plain, unavoidable truth sitting underneath the gossip, that he did not want Cordelia gone, not for one single day, and that the feeling he carried for her by then had stopped being gratitude a good while back and had grown into something he had not let himself name, because he was afraid of what it would mean to say it out loud to a woman who had already given him everything and asked for nothing in return, not even this. If Ransom and Cordelia's story is worth your time, consider becoming a channel member. It's a small, easy way to support the channel, and the join button is right beside the channel name. Their courtship, when it finally began in earnest, was nothing like courtship as young people practice it, all nerves and stolen glances across a dance floor. It was slower and steadier and built the way everything of real worth on that ranch had been built. One honest day's labor stacked careful atop the last. It showed itself first in small things, neither of them remarked on out loud. Ransom took to riding the far fence line with Cordelia of a Sunday afternoon, work that did not strictly need doing but that gave them an hour of quiet together with no chores pressing at either end of it. Cordelia began setting 2 cups out for coffee before he even asked, and started saving him the good end piece of whatever bread she baked, and Ransom noticed and let it pass without comment and ate it slow and felt something warm settle in him each time. He started noticing, too, in a way he had not let himself notice before, the particular way evening light caught in her dark hair when she stood at the stove with her sleeves rolled up, the low, easy sound of her voice when she talked to the horses, the quiet, unhurried strength in her hands, that he found himself wanting to hold rather than merely watch. By the second summer, the whole valley had settled, more or less, into treating the Cade place as a 2-person operation, regardless of what the county record said, and Cordelia herself had begun, slow and half against her own will, to let herself imagine a future on that land instead of merely a repayment owed and a debt discharged. She caught herself once hanging wash on a bright morning, humming a tune she had not hummed since before her first husband died, and stood there a long minute afterward with the clothespin still in her hand, startled at herself, wondering when exactly she had stopped merely surviving her days on that porch. Looking forward to them. There came an evening in that second summer when they sat together on the porch after supper as they did most nights by then, watching the light go gold and then rose and then gray over the western ridge, and Ransom found himself telling her for the first time plainly about Elo and not the grief of losing her, which Cordelia already understood in her bones better than most, but the good years before it, the 4 years of building this very house together. The orchard Eloan had wanted on the south slope and never lived to see planted. Cordelia listened without once interrupting, her hands still in her lap, her whole quiet attention given over to him, the way she gave her whole attention to anything she considered worth doing properly. When he finished, she offered only that they ought to plant that orchard, that it seemed a shame to let a good idea die simply because the one who had, it wasn't there to see it grow. Ransom looked at her a long moment in the fading light and understood, with a kind of quiet certainty that settled into him like the last piece of a puzzle finding its place, that he was not merely grateful to this woman. He loved her, plainly and completely, in the unhurried, weathered way, A person loves something they have watched prove itself true through every hard season it was tested by. You once said you never expected to find anything here beyond paying off an old debt, he said quietly into the gathering dark. I didn't. Her answer came slow. I came here to settle an account and be on my way after, same as I've done everywhere else my whole life. I never once let myself think past that, because thinking past, it felt like asking for a thing I had no right to expect. And now? She was quiet a long moment, her voice, when it came, gone soft and a little unsteady, stripped of the careful reserve she usually kept close around her. Now I find I don't much want to be on my way anywhere at all. I came here to pay you back, ransom Cade, and somewhere across 2 years I stopped keeping count of the debt entirely and started counting something else instead. I don't rightly know what to call what it turned into. A home, maybe. Or, she stopped herself, coloring faintly even in the dim light, and looked down at her own hands. Or a man. Plain now, and a little breathless, with the risk of saying it. I came looking to settle a debt and found a home I did not expect, and a man I did not expect to want to spend the rest of my days beside. I don't know what that makes us, but I know I'm done pretending I don't feel it. Ransom Cade took the hand of the woman who had saved everything he had left in this world, without once asking for a single thing in return, and knew exactly, entirely, without one shred of doubt, what that made them. He asked her properly the following week, on a clear cold morning up on the rise, where Eloan lay buried under a stone. Cordelia herself had kept clean of moss for 2 full years running, because it seemed to him the only fitting place to do it, not to erase what had come before, but to fold it honestly into what was coming next. He let her know, plainly, that he did not think Eloan would grudge either one of them this, that a woman who had wanted an orchard and children and a long, full life on this land would want, more than anything else, for the land itself to go on being loved the way she had loved it. And for the man she had married to find his way back to living rather than spend the whole rest of his years standing empty beside her grave. Cordelia wept then, for the first time Ransom had ever seen her weep, not the careful, controlled tears of that first terrible morning on the porch, but real, unguarded weeping, and had her yes out before he had even finished the whole of the asking. They married that same autumn on the rise near Eloan's well-kept grave, with old Purdy standing witness and half of Cottonwood turning out despite Mrs. Bruette's stiff disapproval, because, by then, the whole valley had heard the entire story how a stranger's forgotten kindness had traveled 7 years and come home 7-fold, how a plain, quietly beautiful widow had spent 2 hard years loving a dead man's land back to life for no better reason than that it seemed the right thing to do, and how a ruined man had ridden home expecting nothing at all, and found instead the whole rest of his life waiting for him in his own dooryard. Cordelia asked, at the small, quiet ceremony, that Eloan's name be spoken as part of it, that the woman be remembered as part of the very land that had brought her and Ransom together rather than set aside and forgotten. Ransom loved her all the more, standing there in the autumn light, for asking it. The morning of the wedding, Cordelia wore a plain blue dress she had let out and taken in herself over 3 careful evenings, the only good fabric she owned, and stood a long while in front of the small mirror in the room that had once been Eloan's and was now her own. A woman who, 1 year before, had been prepared to pack a single trunk and vanish down a lonely road without a word said for herself. Ransom met her at the top of the rise in his one good coat, the leg the mountain had ruined aching plain in the cold morning air, and did not try to hide the way his hands shook, taking hers, because there did not seem, on a day like that one, to be any good reason left to hide a single true thing from her. Old Purdy read the words in a voice that cracked twice, with feeling he swore afterward was only the cold, and when it came time for the ring, Ransom slid onto her work-roughened finger a plain gold band that had been his mother's, the one possession from before the war he had carried through every hard mile of his life. Until now. Afterward, the whole gathered valley came down off the rise to a long table set up in the yard, groaning under more food than either of their two households had seen in years, brought by neighbors who a season before had only whispered about the arrangement, and now stood grinning and pressing gifts of preserves and quilts and a young rooster into Cordelia's arms, because a valley that has watched a story like theirs unfold in front of it end to end cannot help but claim a piece of the ending for its own. Years later, when their grandchildren were old enough to sit still on the porch steps of an evening and ask for the story, Ransom would tell it the same way every time, starting always with the smoke, how a dead man rode down that road with nothing left in him at all, and saw a thread of wood smoke rising off his own roof, and how that one small, impossible sight had been, in the end, the whole hinge the rest of his life turned on. Cordelia would sit beside him with her mending in her lap, saying little, the way she had always said little, letting him have the telling of it, though every grandchild who grew up on that ranch understood plainly enough, without ever quite being told outright, that the real heart of the story sat quiet beside their grandfather with a needle in her hand, and always had. The Cade place thrived for 40 years after that morning, worked first by the two of them together, and later by children neither one had let themselves hope for at their age, and by grandchildren. After that, the same green fields and mended fences and fat cattle that had stopped a grieving man cold in the road one autumn morning, on and on down the years. Land that a forgotten kindness had once saved, tended now by the woman who repaid it, and the man who had never known until the very hour he rode home expecting a grave, that he had already cast that same kindness out into the world 7 years before. He had come home from 2 years, given up for dead, expecting to find nothing left at all, and had found instead a quiet woman tending his fields, who had loved his home back to living warmth entirely out of gratitude for a kindness. And in the years that followed, sitting many an evening on that same porch with Cordelia's hand in his, Ransom came to understand the truest thing he ever learned in his whole hard life, that no kindness done honestly, that the smallest good a person does for a stranger, has its own quiet way of finding its way home again, exactly when it is needed most, and that sometimes a man rides back from the dead expecting only to say one last goodbye, and a woman on the porch who was never going to let it die. Thank you for riding along with Ransom and Cordelia all the way to the end. Consider becoming a channel member if you'd like. The join button is right beside the channel name, and Cottonwood Country has more than one kindness left to tell.